The trains never stopped screaming. Iron on iron, wheel on ice, metal dragging the last warmth out of the air. Inside the cattle cars, no one spoke. They had learned that breath was rationed too. Somewhere beyond the frozen windows waited Kolyma, Vorkuta, Norilsk, names that meant nothing yet, but soon would mean everything. The guards called it transportation. The prisoners called it burial in motion. When the train finally halted, silence rushed in, so sudden it felt loud. Doors slammed open. Light knifed through the darkness. Men stumbled out. Soldiers, farmers, poets, doctors, each one blinking like a newborn in a world that wanted nothing from them. Snow blinded them, not because it was bright, but because it reflected nothing back. The wind took their names first. The guards replaced them with numbers. Numbers don't freeze, they said. They were marched from the train to the camp. Some collapsed on the way. The guards didn't shout. They didn't have to. Falling was its own punishment. One guard simply marked a tally in his notebook. One fewer ration to issue tomorrow. The narrator's voice lowers. It was 1937. The peak of the Great Terror. 1 in every 100 Soviet citizens had disappeared into the Gulag system. Workers who missed quotas, soldiers who'd blinked at the wrong time, strangers who'd spoken too loudly in queues. The lucky ones got 10 years. The unlucky never got paperwork. By dusk, the new arrivals stood in a line before a gate of barbed wire and slogans, "Work is honor. Work is freedom." The men read the words but couldn't find the meaning. One whispered to another, "If work is freedom, then why are they all so afraid?" The first night was a lesson in limits. The barrack had no beds, only boards. Frost crawled up through the floor. The guards threw in a bucket of soup that was mostly water and called it supper. No spoons. You drank, you lived. You hesitated, you starved. The prisoners watched each other drink. Each face became a mirror showing what fear looked like when it realized there was no bottom. The soup tasted of rust, old bones, and something nameless that burned the tongue. One man, a teacher from Minsk, tried to pray. The guard laughed and told him God had been reassigned to accounting. They took his Bible, used it to start the fire. The narrator describes the first morning, -47 degrees, wind sharp enough to carve. The guards lined them up, counted, and counted again, though they'd already done it the night before. Counting wasn't about accuracy. It was about ownership. The men were given shovels that snapped like kindling in the cold. They were told to dig foundations for barracks that would collapse by spring. They called it productive labor. But even the guards knew it was pointless. Pointless work breaks more than bone. It teaches the mind to forget why it should keep going. By noon, frostbite was eating through gloves. They learned how to keep moving even after the ET. Fingers stopped listening. A prisoner collapsed, his face turning white before he hit the ground. The guards didn't move to help. They waited. When the twitching stopped, one man was ordered to drag the body aside. It wasn't cruelty. It was schedule. The wind carried smells, sweat, diesel, hunger. The camp itself breathed like a living thing. The narrator describes it as an organism that digests men and leaves only bones for memory. It didn't need to kill them quickly. The system understood something worse. If you take enough pieces from a man's soul, he'll finish the dying himself. That night, someone whispered a song. Not loud, just enough to remind the walls they were still walls and not graves. The melody rose, then broke apart when the guards banged on the boards. The singer stopped. Later, when they looked for him in the morning, his bunk was empty. By the second day, the men had stopped asking questions. By the third, they had stopped using names. The teacher from Minsk became the tall one. The soldier was the strong one. The poet, who'd been arrested for writing about summer, was now the quiet one. The guards didn't need to strike anymore. The prisoners struck themselves with silence. The narrator explains that by 1938, an estimated 2,000 men a week arrived in camps across Siberia. Half would die before spring. But death wasn't the purpose. It was the byproduct. The real purpose was transformation. The Gulag wasn't built only to punish bodies. It was designed to unmake people, to drain the color, the memory, the self, until what stood shivering in the snow wasn't man or beast, but something in between. Something that obeyed without believing, that breathed without wanting. That was the secret no one wrote down. The Gulag didn't wait for you to die. It made dying a process you could perform while still standing. At dusk, the guards called for inspection. The men lined up, numb and obedient. Snow fell again, gentle, almost kind. A guard counted them, frowned, and ordered another recount. The numbers didn't match. They never did. The missing man was found behind the barrack, sitting upright, eyes open, frozen solid. In his lap lay a spoon, wood, bitten clean in half. The guards didn't write his name. They just added a tick to a column marked losses. The narrator pauses. The wind howls. The night returns. And then he says softly, "That was the first step, the moment the living learned what ghosts felt like." Cliffhanger. The camera pans across the barracks, and the narrator whispers, "By morning, half of them would still be breathing, but none of them would still be men." The snow didn't stop. It fell day after day, erasing footsteps faster than men could make them. By the end of the first week, no one remembered what direction the camp faced. North, south, it didn't matter. Every direction ended with wire. They learned the new language quickly, commands shouted in. Short bursts, gestures that meant work, move, or die quietly. Words were dangerous, silence was safer. In the Gulag, silence became its own religion. The narrator's voice slows. Every prisoner was stripped not just of clothes, but of identity. Before entering the barracks, each man handed over everything he had carried through the arrest: watches, letters, family photographs. The guards burned them, one by one, in the same barrel used to melt snow for water. When it was the teacher's turn, he hesitated, holding a photograph of his daughter. The guard laughed, snatched it, and threw it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The man stared at the smoke rising and whispered her name, once, softly. He never spoke it again. From that moment forward, they were numbers. The poet became 214, the soldier 356, the teacher 419. Foremen barked these numbers in place of names as if naming itself were treason. It wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. A name ties you to a life. A number just keeps count. Each morning began with a list read aloud. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, frost clinging to eyelashes. They waited for their numbers. Not hearing it could mean one of two things: freedom or a frozen ditch. Both sounded the same. The narrator describes a rule unspoken but universal. If a guard said your number wrong, you didn't correct him. You accepted the new one. To correct authority was to remind them you still thought of yourself as human. Humans could be punished. Numbers could only be replaced. Within days, voices began to fade. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter disappeared entirely, like a word erased from language. The prisoners no longer said "I." They said "we," and eventually, "it." One night, the poet woke the teacher, whispering that he had written a new verse. The teacher stared at him, unblinking. "No," he said, "you didn't." By morning, the poet's verse was gone, and so was he. The narrator pauses. There's no record of where the poet went. In the camp logs, the entry beside his number reads simply, "Transferred to Section 9." Section 9 didn't exist. The transformation continued quietly. Hunger carved away thought, cold filed down will, and sameness erased faces. At first, men tried to remember who they had been: doctors, writers, engineers. But those words lost meaning. The Gulag didn't care about what they had done. It only cared about what they could still lift. Every few weeks, a new train arrived. Fresh faces stepped off the wagons, blinking the same disbelief. The older prisoners watched them with pity, not compassion. They knew what the newcomers didn't. The worst part wasn't death. The worst part was surviving long enough to forget why you wanted to. The narrator recalls an account from Norilsk, 1941. A prisoner asked a guard if he could write a letter home. The guard nodded and handed him paper. The man wrote for hours, tears freezing onto his face. When he handed it back, the guard fed it into the stove. "You wrote it," the guard said. "That's enough." By the second winter, something strange began to happen. The men moved in rhythm, their footsteps synchronizing without command. At the worksite, they shoveled, lifted, and swung picks like a single organism. Not because they were ordered to, but because it made the hours vanish faster. They were becoming efficient ghosts, visible but no longer alive in the way that mattered. The narrator explains that the Soviet authorities called this process re-education through labor. But what they really taught was obedience through disappearance. The guards didn't need to shout anymore. The men knew when to wake, when to march, when to freeze. They learned by imitation, not instruction. Even new prisoners fell into step within days, as if something in the air rewrote their instincts. One of the guards, a young man from Smolensk, once said he could tell how long a prisoner had been inside just by the way he blinked. New ones blink too often, he said. Old ones forget how. By spring, the snow began to melt. What it revealed was worse than winter itself. Hands and faces surfaced through the thaw, pale and expressionless. The older prisoners didn't look away. They recognized them, not as individuals, but as reminders. Every corpse was a reflection of what still walked. At night, when the wind passed through the wire, it made a sound like whispering. Some said it was the dead speaking. Others said it was the living, rehearsing. The narrator remembers a camp doctor's note found years later. They die long before they stop breathing. The body is only the last witness. By the third season, even death lost its ceremony. The guards no longer logged the missing. The men no longer dug graves. They simply covered the bodies with a thin layer of snow. Nature was better at hiding evidence than bureaucracy. The teacher, the one who'd lost his daughter's photo, started writing names in soot on the wall of his barrack. Not full names, just initials, so he wouldn't forget. Every few days, a guard wiped them away. One morning, the wall was clean before he woke. No soot, no letters, just frost. He pressed his palm to it, leaving a print. That night, the wind howled louder than usual. It sounded almost like the whisper of erased names returning. Cliffhanger. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. But ghosts don't whisper for justice. They whisper because they remember what silence feels like. Then he adds, and soon, silence itself would become the only language left. Hunger became the new calendar. The men no longer counted days by the sun, but by how long it had been since the last real taste of bread. Morning rations came as slices that could be measured against breath. A full day of labor earned 400 grams. Falling behind in the quota meant 200. Those who collapsed received nothing at all. The narrator's tone slows. This was not starvation as punishment. It was starvation as design. The Soviet state had perfected the mathematics of suffering. Each camp calculated its labor-to-calorie ratio, how much a man could work before he began to die, and how long he could keep dying without actually stopping. By the second winter, the camp had learned to move like a single starving creature. The guards didn't need to chase them anymore. Men dragged themselves to work, compelled not by orders but by the small hope that if they moved enough, their bodies would remember warmth. The food line was a ritual, a long procession of hollow faces moving toward a barrel of soup that smelled faintly of cabbage and oil. They drank from tin cups so battered that sometimes the liquid leaked out faster than they could swallow. Nobody complained. Complaints were for people with futures. One night, the teacher from Minsk dreamed of bread. Not the black sour ration, but real bread. Golden, soft, alive. When he woke, he could still smell it. He searched under his blanket, believing for a moment it might be real. Then he saw the frost forming on his hands and laughed until his ribs hurt. At the quarry, the guards watched from towers. The prisoners swung picks into frozen stone. Each strike echoed like the tick of a clock that didn't move forward. One man collapsed mid-swing. Another took his place without pause. There was no funeral, no prayer. The body was left where it fell. The next morning, it was gone. The narrator explains how hunger rewrote morality. It turned friends into competitors, kindness into risk. A crust of bread was worth a man's loyalty. A potato peel could start a fight that ended in death, but the worst battles weren't between prisoners. They were inside them. One guard once said that hunger was the best guard dog. It never slept, never failed. By late spring, some prisoners began to eat grass. Others boiled leather boots for soup. The doctor, a former university physician, dissected rats for their marrow and taught the men how to cook them without fire. The secret, he said, is to eat before you remember what it was. The narrator recalls an account from Kolyma. A man caught stealing food from the kitchen was beaten and thrown into the snow. By dawn, he was frozen solid, still clutching the crust that had condemned him. They left him there for 2 days as warning, but on the third morning, the body was gone, and no one had seen who took it. Hunger bred ghosts long before it bred corpses. Men began to talk to shadows as if they were dinner guests. Some claimed to smell meat in the air. The guards laughed. They knew what it meant. When you could smell what didn't exist, it was the body's way of saying goodbye. One night, the narrator describes, the camp fell silent after curfew. A guard patrolling the fence saw movement near the kitchen. He raised his rifle, expecting a rat, but froze when he saw what it was. A prisoner, crouched beside a pile of bones, whispering to them. Not eating, just whispering. When the guard approached, the man looked up, eyes wide, lips blue, and said, "They told me they're not done yet." The guard fired once. The echo hung in the air longer than the sound itself. The next morning, the work bell rang as usual. No one mentioned the shot. They had learned to treat death like weather, unavoidable, inconvenient, not worth discussion. Hunger had changed them in ways that even the guards didn't understand. It wasn't just the body that thinned, it was memory. Men forgot what flavor was, what warmth was, what laughter sounded like. The past itself began to rot inside them. The narrator explains, psychologists later studying survivors noticed how many could no longer describe their own families in detail. Faces blurred, voices vanished. The Gulag had erased the very ability to recall affection. A prisoner once said, "The hardest part wasn't the dying. It was realizing that I could live without anything human left." As weeks turned into something longer than weeks, the men began to share hallucinations. They saw food, cities, women, sometimes even sunlight. A shared madness spread through the barracks like smoke. The guards didn't intervene. Madness made men easier to manage. One man, delirious with hunger, began digging near the latrine, saying he'd found bread underground. The others watched, too weak to stop him. When he hit Frost and tore his hands open, he looked up and said, "They're hiding it from us." He died that night, smiling. The narrator pauses. The camp's official report listed him as expired due to exposure. But the doctor wrote a second note privately. He died of imagination. By the third winter, the difference between the living and the dead had become academic. The living moved slower, spoke softer, and stared longer at the fires that never burned long enough. The teacher from Minsk, the one who had once been afraid to forget his daughter's name, stopped speaking entirely. One night, he sat by the window, watching the snow swirl. Another prisoner asked what he was looking at. The teacher pointed at the frost-forming patterns on the glass and whispered, "Letters. She's writing to me." By morning, he was still sitting there, eyes open, frozen solid. The frost had indeed formed words across the window. None of them were in any known language. Cliffhanger. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. The Gulag didn't kill by bullets alone. It starved men of the world until they no longer knew which side of the window they belonged to. Then he adds, and the next lesson would be colder still, because even hunger had an end, but work never did. Work. It was the only command that still meant something. In the Gulag, a man's worth was measured not by what he knew, but by what he could still lift. When his muscles stopped obeying, he was no longer a prisoner. He was waste. Every morning before dawn, the whistle screamed. The men shuffled into lines, half asleep, half alive. The guards didn't need whips anymore. Cold did the work for them. 45-degree Grenade turned breath into knives. Frost glued their eyelids half shut. Each blink felt like breaking glass. They marched toward the mines, the quarry, the endless forest that waited to be cut down and rebuilt again. Shovels hit ground that might as well have been stone. Pickaxes bounced off frozen soil. The sound carried through the air like an execution drum. The narrator explains, productive labor was the state's favorite lie. Camps produced timber, gold, and coal, but the real production was obedience. The point wasn't to build anything that lasted. It was to teach men that effort itself was punishment. Guards walked among them, rifles slung casually. They rarely fired. A single look was enough to make a man dig faster. Sometimes they didn't even bother giving orders. Men worked by instinct now, like machines that didn't need oil, only fear. One prisoner, once an engineer, began to talk to his shovel as if it were a person. "You're the only one who listens," he whispered. "You've seen everything I've buried." When another man laughed, the engineer looked at him blankly and said, "Don't laugh, it remembers." By evening, the men were herded back through the gates. Their boots left trails of blood in the snow. No one mentioned whose. In the barracks, they collapsed on the boards, steam rising from their bodies like ghosts trying to leave. The guards counted heads again, even though they knew some of those heads would stop breathing before morning. The narrator pauses. In the camp reports, death was written as natural attrition. The numbers didn't include exhaustion, despair, or the strange phenomenon the prisoners called the quiet turning. The quiet turning was when a man simply stopped, not fainted or froze, just stopped. He would set down his tool, stand upright, and stare at nothing. A minute later, he'd fall. No convulsions, no sound, as if something inside him had remembered how to leave. The doctor called it cardiac arrest. The prisoners called it surrender. One survivor later wrote, "We didn't fear death, we feared becoming the kind of living thing that no longer knew it had a choice." That was the Gulag's secret art, killing the will before the body. The narrator tells of a day in 1942 when a group was ordered to move 20 tons of gravel by hand. A blizzard hit halfway through. The guards gave no order to stop. The snow grew so thick that men could only see the ground between their boots. When the storm passed, they found a line of bodies frozen mid-swing, still gripping their shovels. The guards laughed. "Efficient to the end." Those who survived that shift didn't speak for days. One said later, "The dead worked faster than we did." By spring, the ground thawed, and the work changed from mining to construction. Barracks had to be rebuilt after each collapse. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The men who built their own prisons were also rebuilding their own graves. A rumor spread that the hardest workers might earn early release. No one knew who started it. The guards denied it, but the rumor did their job better than any rifle. Men began competing for impossible quotas. They lifted until their arms tore, carried until their spines cracked. Every broken bone was another step toward a freedom that didn't exist. One man, a former officer, broke both his hands moving rocks. He went to the infirmary and begged to be sent back to work. The medic said, "You'll die." He smiled. "Then maybe they'll let me go." He did die 2 days later, smiling. The narrator explains that the Gulag was built on a paradox. Men worked themselves to death believing it would save them. The system needed that hope alive just long enough to keep them moving. By the third year, no one remembered what enough meant. The teacher from Minsk, one of the few still speaking, began to keep count in scratches on a beam above his bunk. Each mark was another day he'd survived. One night, a guard noticed the marks and scraped them away with his knife. "No counting," he said. "Time belongs to Moscow." The teacher made new marks the next morning. When the guard saw, he laughed and said, "You want to keep track? Fine." That night, they assigned him to night shift, clearing ice from under the trucks. The temperature dropped to 50 yards. In the morning, they found him frozen beneath the wheels, hands still gripping the iron rod. The guard counted the bodies, then smiled. "Now he's marked one last time." The men learned the lesson quickly. Don't measure anything, not time, not hope, not progress. Every tally was an act of rebellion, every memory a crime. The narrator's tone softens. Survivors later wrote that work didn't just break the body, it replaced identity. You became the motion of your hands, the rhythm of your shovel. Even dreams became mechanical. One prisoner dreamed every night of digging a hole so deep he reached the earth's core. When he told the others, they laughed bitterly. "If you get there," one said, "send us heat." By summer, the men had stopped dreaming altogether. The narrator ends the part quietly. The camp no longer needed guards or fences or guns. The work itself had become the warden. And when men began to forget each other, he whispers, that was when betrayal started, because hunger and labor were only the tools. The real weapon was trust. Betrayal began quietly, like frost creeping across glass. No one noticed it at first or pretended not to. In the beginning, they'd still shared scraps of bread, a whispered joke, or a cigarette butt found in the dirt. But the Gulag was patient. It didn't need to tell men to betray one another. It simply made survival depend on it. 1. Morning. The guards posted a notice. Informers will receive extra rations. They didn't have to say what to inform about. The meaning was clear. A single whispered accusation could mean a full slice of bread, maybe two. That night, the barrack was quieter than usual. Men spoke in half sentences, watching each other from the corners of their eyes. No one trusted coughs anymore. The next day, 3 prisoners were taken away. No one saw who pointed. The narrator's voice sinks lower. The worst part wasn't fear. It was curiosity. Men began to wonder what might happen if they said something, anything. The system had found a way to weaponize hope. One of the guards explained it simply. Every man has a price. Some sell for bread, some for warmth. All sell eventually. In the camp at Vorkuta, a prisoner named Anton had kept a notebook hidden in his boot. He wrote poems on cigarette paper, not for rebellion, but to remind himself he could still think. One morning, the notebook disappeared. That night, he was called to interrogation. The guards didn't ask questions. They already had answers. The notebook was on the table. Someone had turned him in. When they were finished with him, Anton could still breathe but not speak. They sent him to the punishment pit, an open hole in the ground lined with ice. He lasted 3 days. The informer who had betrayed him sat beside the fire that night, chewing his extra bread slowly, staring at the flames. When one of the men asked how it tasted, he said, "Like nothing." Trust had become a myth. Even a glance could be fatal. If 2 men were seen talking too long, both vanished. If someone smiled, the guards assumed conspiracy. Laughter was treated like an alarm. The narrator explains that in most camps, informers made up nearly 10% of the population. They weren't outsiders. They were friends, cellmates, sometimes even family. The NKVD understood what philosophers never could. Fear rewrites loyalty faster than ideology. The teacher from Minsk once said that friendship was the last forbidden act. "It makes you remember there's another world," he whispered, "and that's what they don't want." By 1944, betrayal had replaced conversation. Prisoners spoke in riddles. They used silence as punctuation. They learned to hide thoughts behind empty eyes. Some even forgot how to lie convincingly. Truth and falsehood began to sound the same. A doctor in the infirmary kept notes on what he called the mirror effect. When trust collapses, he wrote, men begin to reflect the cruelty around them. They imitate the guard's tone, repeat their jokes, and soon can't remember which side of the whip they're on. It wasn't madness, it was adaptation. The narrator recalls one night when the guards gathered everyone in the yard. They read a list of numbers, names long forgotten. Each was accused of sabotage, theft, or counter-revolutionary whispering. No evidence was needed. After the Adi reading, the guards fired once into the air. That was enough. The real punishment came later, watching who looked relieved to have survived. A man's silence was now proof of guilt. So was speech. The only safe expression was blankness. The camp evolved into something stranger than cruelty. It became a laboratory of the soul. The authorities wanted to see how far a man could bend before he stopped being human. They discovered there was no limit, only stages. The first stage was hunger. The second was exhaustion. The third was betrayal. The fourth was acceptance. Acceptance looked like peace from the outside. Men obeyed, ate when told, slept when told, worked until their bodies broke. But inside, something colder than death had taken root. It wasn't fear anymore. It was indifference. One evening, a new prisoner arrived, a young soldier accused of cowardice. He still believed in fairness. He still asked questions. The older men tried to warn him, "Don't trust anyone. Don't offer kindness. Don't even think too loudly." But he didn't listen. 3 weeks later, the soldier disappeared. The guards said nothing. A day after, a ration slip appeared on one man's bunk. Twice the usual amount. He didn't eat it. He just stared at it all night, then buried it in the snow at dawn. The narrator speaks softly now. When everyone becomes a suspect, guilt stops having meaning. And when guilt stops mattering, so does innocence. The teacher from Minsk was caught humming a song one night. The melody wasn't political, just beautiful. Someone reported him for propaganda of melancholy. He was taken away at sunrise. When the barrack woke, the air still carried the tune. The man who had turned him in wept quietly in his bunk. Another whispered, "Save your tears, they belong to them now." After that, no one sang again. The narrator pauses. Betrayal had done what bullets never could. It had made the living finish the work of the dead. In official records, the word used was re-education. But the truth was simpler. The Gulag didn't just destroy trust. It inverted it, made loyalty an illness and suspicion a cure. By the time the thaw came, most prisoners had forgotten how to look another man in the eyes. The camp was full of people who still breathed, but none who could meet a gaze. And yet, that was not the worst fate. There were darker places still, the punishment cells waiting under the ground, where even the sound of betrayal couldn't reach. The punishment cells waited beneath the camp like open mouths. You didn't walk there, you were swallowed. The guards called them refrigerators. They were pits carved from permafrost, deep enough that sound didn't return. Once the iron door shut, the world ended in a single echo. A man could survive there for days, maybe a week, depending on how much of himself he still had left. There was no light, no space to stand. You sat, knees pressed to chest, and waited for the mind to begin, inventing shapes in the dark. The walls sweated frost. The floor was an ice sheet stained by old breaths. One of the survivors later said the cells didn't punish. They sculpted. They carved away thought, fear, memory, until what was left was a smooth surface for silence to rest on. The narrator's tone softens. Those who went in with faith came out whispering to themselves. Those who went in whispering didn't come out at all. The guards enjoyed sending men down there not for crimes, but for emotion. A smile during roll call, a glance at the horizon, a word spoken in sleep. The Gulag's greatest sin was hope. A story passed through the camps about a man who began singing in his cell after 3 days in darkness. The song wasn't Russian, not even words, just humming. The guards opened the door to silence him, but the man was gone. The floor was empty except for frost in the shape of 2 footprints facing the wall. They said he had walked out through the ice itself. The older prisoners laughed when they told it, not because they believed, but because the idea of escape, even a ghost's, was worth laughter. The narrator explains that these punishment pits existed across all camps, Vorkuta, Norilsk, Kolyma, designed not to kill, but to unmake. At -40, the body burns from the inside. The frost gnaws at bone marrow first. When nerves die, warmth floods in, tricking the prisoner into thinking he's safe. That was the last thought most ever had. Finally, warmth. One guard kept a ledger. He called it the Book of Silence. Each name had a single word beside it, cooled. The camps above continued without pause. Work went on, men disappeared, new ones arrived. But underground, the cells filled with whispers that had no owners. Sometimes, at night, those above ground swore they heard tapping through the earth. Not random, rhythmic, like someone knocking in code. No one dared answer. The teacher from Minsk had gone below months before. He'd smiled at a sunset, and that was enough. When spring came, the guards opened his cell. The floor was dry. The ice had melted. But where his hands had rested, there were small scratches, circles within circles, drawn by frozen nails. No one ever figured out what they meant. One doctor who examined the cells after the war wrote, "The walls remember everything. The cold preserves confession better than paper." The narrator's voice darkens. Solitary confinement didn't only haunt those inside, it infected the camp above. Prisoners began speaking in shorter sentences, afraid of hearing their own words too long. Men started sitting apart, even in crowded barracks. The silence underground had become contagious. By 1947, the camp sounded like an abandoned church, tools clanging, boots crunching, but no voices. The guards didn't need to enforce order anymore. The punishment had done its job. The living had learned how to behave like the dead. One winter, a guard disappeared. They searched for 2 days. On the 3rd, they found him at the edge of the punishment trench, staring into it. His eyes were open, his breath slow. When they tried to pull him away, He muttered, "They're still talking down there." He was sent back to the city. The next guard kept the door bolted even when the cells were empty. The narrator describes visiting the remains decades later. The pits were gone, filled with earth and snow, but the air above them was still colder than anywhere else. Locals said animals avoided that patch, circling wide, as if the ground hummed with memory. One old Yakut guide spat in the snow and said, "Ghosts don't rise here, they wait." The worst cruelty of the punishment cells wasn't the frost or the dark. It was what waited when you came out. The world looked wrong. The light hurt. Sound felt too loud. Men came out blinking, smiling faintly, unable to understand why the others looked afraid of them. They called it the glass look. You could see through their eyes, but nothing looked back. The narrator slows. Those men walked, worked, even spoke, but they had already crossed something no one else could name. The camp didn't free them. It released them. Years later, survivors said the punishment cells were the Gulag's true invention. Hunger killed the body, work broke the will, but isolation, silence, was what created ghosts. Some of those ghosts never left. Guards who returned home swore they still heard breathing when they closed their cellar doors. And in spring, when the snow melted, water seeped into the pits and froze again each night, trapping the air inside. When wind blew across the vents, it made a sound that might have been the earth exhaling. No one stayed close enough to be sure. Time stopped having edges. There were no weeks, no months, only the blur between waking and work. The men stopped counting years because numbers had betrayed them too many times. Seasons still changed, but in the Gulag, even the sun seemed to obey Moscow. The narrator's voice slows. After the punishment cells, something strange spread through the camp, a quiet that felt different from fear. It was resignation, the kind that turns minutes into fog. Men forgot what day it was, then forgot that days existed. A prisoner once said, "We stopped waiting for tomorrow. Tomorrow stopped coming." When spring thawed the snow, the mud swallowed boots, then froze again before anyone could move. Frost returned before hope did. No one talked about the future. They spoke only of shifts, morning, evening, night. The guards didn't keep calendars. They didn't need to. The camps themselves measured time by decay. Shovels wore down faster than memories. The only reliable clocks were bones. The rate they surfaced from the melting ground told how long winter had lasted. A man once found a rusted watch buried near the quarry. It was still ticking. No one knew whose it had been. He wound it every morning, not to know the time, but to hear something still obey rules. One day it stopped. He buried it again. The narrator explains that by 1948, entire camps had forgotten what year it was. Prisoners celebrated New Year in July, then again in September. The guards didn't correct them. Even they had lost count. When the outside world moved forward, the Gulag circled itself like a frozen clock hand that refused to move past midnight. Letters sometimes arrived months late, sometimes years. When a man finally received one from home, it was often written by someone already dead. He'd read it anyway, mouthing words that no longer had a speaker. One wrote to his wife for 8 years, not knowing she had been executed the same week he was arrested. His last letter ended with, "I'll be home soon." No one knows if he meant the camp or the earth. The narrator pauses. Memory began to deform in strange ways. Men remembered their pasts as though they belonged to someone else. One said he could see his mother's face clearly, but couldn't remember if she had been kind. Another swore he still felt the warmth of a child's hand in his, though he couldn't recall the child's name. The camp doctor recorded what he called temporal collapse. The body aged normally, but the mind froze like water in glass, still clear but unmoving. Even the guards weren't immune. One officer kept a diary. His handwriting grew smaller each month until it became a single repeating sentence. They are not the only ones losing time. At night, the wind made strange sounds across the wires, as though the camp were speaking in its sleep. Some swore the sound carried words. Others said it was just the frost shifting. But the difference hardly mattered. It was proof that the Gulag itself was alive, dreaming of those it had already consumed. One thaw, the men were ordered to clear a trench behind the barracks. The ground was soft for the first time in months. Shovels hit something that wasn't earth, Bones surfaced, hundreds, maybe thousands. The guards didn't stop them. They told them to keep digging. The prisoners worked silently, uncovering ribs, skulls, scraps of cloth. At the bottom of the trench, a pocket watch ticked once, then broke. When night came, they filled the hole again. No one marked it. The next morning, the ground was smooth, as if the earth itself had grown tired of remembering. The narrator explains that time was part of the punishment. Endless repetition broke the sense of before and after. Without memory, guilt disappears. Without guilt, identity dissolves. The Gulag didn't want slaves. It wanted blanks. One morning, a prisoner woke convinced it was his birthday. He asked for bread, just a crumb, to celebrate. No one answered. That evening, he asked again. The guard gave him half a ration and said, "Eat quick. It's everyone's birthday here." He laughed quietly until he didn't. The barrack logs from that month show 5 suicides, 7 natural losses, and 1 disappearance. The missing man's name was crossed out, replaced with a dash. The narrator lowers his voice. That dash appears in thousands of old Soviet records. It means unrecorded, unburied, unseen. For the bureaucracy, it was neat. For the prisoners, it was immortality of the cruelest kind. At the height of the thaw, the river flooded, carrying old bones downstream. Children in nearby villages found them on the banks. Some wore chains on their wrists, others still had boots. The locals buried them quietly, without crosses, afraid of questions. When the government inspectors came years later, they called it erosion. Inside the camp, nothing changed. The fences rusted but held. The bells still rang each morning, the guards still counted, though no one knew why. The numbers never matched. One evening, a young prisoner asked an old man how long he'd been there. The old man smiled faintly. "Since before you were arrested," he said, "and I'll be here after you're gone." The young one didn't ask again. The narrator speaks softly now. In the Gulag, eternity wasn't a promise. It was a schedule. When the aurora appeared across the winter sky, the men stared at it in silence. One whispered, "Maybe that's the time we lost." No one corrected him. The light faded, leaving darkness thicker than before. And far below the permafrost, the old punishment cells filled with meltwater again. Each spring, the air inside bubbled once, like a breath resurfacing. No one could explain why. No one wanted to. Women came in the second wave. Teachers, nurses, students, wives of enemies of the people. The camps had been built for men, but the state had decided suffering needed no gender. They arrived wearing city shoes that froze to their feet before morning. Guards watched, amused, as they tried to walk on the snow without falling. The narrator's voice softens, almost careful. There was no separation at first. Women worked in the same pits, carried the same loads, died the same deaths. The difference was how the living looked at them. For men who had forgotten tenderness, the sight of a woman was confusing, half memory, half temptation. The system knew it. It used it. By 1940, mixed camps had become common. The authorities called them co-educational labor colonies. The prisoners called them something else, breeding zones. Women were given impossible choices: obey and survive, refuse and vanish. Many became camp wives, belonging to guards or higher-ranking prisoners in exchange for extra bread. Some said yes willingly, believing they could protect themselves. Others didn't say anything at all. A nurse named Lida wrote in her hidden diary, "There are no yeses here, only different kinds of silence." The narrator explains that childbirth in the camps was as common as death. Babies were born in infirmaries with broken windows, swaddled in rags torn from uniforms. Most didn't survive the first week. Those who did were taken away within days, labeled state property. A woman from Magadan remembered counting her contractions by the sound of gunfire outside. She never saw her child. The doctor told her, "It's better this way. He'll never know where he came from." At night, the barracks filled with lullabies hummed under breath. Songs mothers sang to children who weren't there. Some men joined in softly, eyes closed, pretending to remember their own families. When inspectors visited from Moscow, they recorded everything as stable. The official report from 1943 lists 327 healthy infants. Historians found the same report again a year later, same number, same names. The line between record and graveyard had blurred completely. The narrator's voice tightens. The children who survived past infancy were moved to orphan camps. Some were adopted by guards' families, others disappeared into the bureaucracy. Decades later, one such child, grown old, visited the ruins of the camp where he'd been born. He said, "It felt like standing in my own shadow." In those years, women carried a double sentence, one for their supposed crime, another for being proof of what the system wanted to forget. The Gulag could hide bodies, but it couldn't hide birth. A survivor named Irina described how women kept calendars on their skin, tiny scratches on their arms, one for each missed cycle. "It was the only part of us we could still measure," she said. "We wanted to know when we stopped belonging to ourselves." One day, guards found a plank behind the infirmary wall. Dozens of small carvings marked it, each a child's initial or maybe a date. The last mark was unfinished, the knife stroke frozen mid-line. No one ever claimed it. The narrator explains that even in this cruelty, fragments of kindness survived. Women taught others how to make thread from bark, how to mend boots with wire, how to turn frost into water. One prisoner said the women were the camp's last proof that tenderness hadn't been fully erased. "When they smiled," he said, "we remembered what human faces used to mean." But kindness was dangerous. The guards feared it more than escape. They separated women from men, built fences inside fences, and ordered that all interaction take place under supervision. Yet at night, whispers crossed those lines. Names passed hand to hand like contraband. In the spring of 1944, a guard caught two prisoners holding hands through the wire. He made them dig a pit together, then stand in it. When they refused to let go, he buried them up to their necks and left them there until morning. The report listed it as disciplinary isolation. The next day, the pit was empty. The frost had covered everything again. The narrator pauses. In the archives, one guard later wrote, "They were still smiling when I left them. I dreamed that night the snow was singing." Years later, when the thaw came, villagers found two skeletons side by side, their hands still clasped, bones fused by cold. The women's camps never disappeared. They were just forgotten faster. After Stalin's death, the documents were buried deeper than the graves. The narrator lowers his voice. The Gulag was supposed to erase memory, but it failed. The women carried the memory in their bodies, in the children who never learned their names, in the songs that no one taught them, but they somehow knew. He pauses again. And somewhere far in the north, in a ruined infirmary where the roof still leaks, explorers once found that wooden plank, the one with the carvings. It was still damp from thawing ice, and on the last line, where the knife had stopped half a century before, the wood had split open just enough to form a shape. It looked like the letter L. No one knew if it was the start of a name or the end of one. When word spread that Stalin was dead, no one believed it at first. Guards whispered. The officers looked nervous. The sky itself seemed confused, too bright for morning, too quiet for lies. Then the sirens sounded. Not the alarm, but the long, low wail that meant announcement. The men stood outside, shivering, waiting for words that didn't come. The guards were waiting too. Finally, the commandant read from a paper that shook in his hands. "Comrade Stalin has passed away." No one spoke. No one cheered. The news fell like another snowstorm, silent, suffocating, unreal. A few men crossed themselves in secret. A guard saw, but didn't stop them. That night, the camp burned its lamps until dawn. The prisoners stayed awake, afraid to sleep. Some thought it was a trick. Others thought it was the end of the world. The narrator's tone tightens. For the first time in 20 years, the camps hesitated. Orders stopped coming from Moscow. Trains carrying new prisoners arrived without paperwork. Lists went missing. Guards didn't know who to kill or who to release. Rumors filled the gaps. Men said they would be freed, that their cases would be reviewed. The trucks were already coming with amnesty forms. For a few days, the Gulag became something it had never been before, hopeful. But hope is dangerous in a place built on despair. When no trucks arrived, men started breaking. Some went mad with laughter. Others refused to work, claiming they were citizens again. A guard shot one of them to make an example, but the bullet only proved the point. No one knew who gave the order anymore. The narrator describes Vorkuta, where thousands of prisoners refused to leave the barracks. They built barricades from broken boards and overturned stoves. They demanded letters, signatures, justice. For 3 days, no one moved. Then, machine guns arrived. The uprising lasted less than an hour. When the shooting stopped, the snow was red. The surviving prisoners went back to work. In Kolyma, word came a week later. The guards said the uprising had been a misunderstanding. They offered soup to everyone who cooperated. Men lined up, bowls shaking in their hands. They ate, crying silently. A prisoner wrote later, "We believed the soup, not because it was warm, but because it was the first thing they gave us without taking something back." By summer, the official decrees arrived. Some prisoners were released, others were reclassified. Many were simply forgotten in paperwork that no one wanted to touch. The Gulag system began to crumble, not with explosions, but with confusion. The narrator pauses. When the gates opened, the guards looked just as lost as the prisoners. Some left with them, uniforms stripped off, faces blank. The hierarchy that had ruled for decades melted like ice. But freedom was not what anyone expected. Men who walked beyond the fences discovered they had nowhere to go. Their families were gone, their homes belonged to others, their own names were still blacklisted. The outside world felt smaller than the camp. One survivor said, "When they opened the gate, I hesitated. I had to remind myself that I was supposed to walk out." Some refused to leave altogether. They stayed, repairing the barracks, tending the fires. A few even volunteered to keep order. One man told the new inspector, "We've already learned how to live here. Outside, I'd only starve." The narrator explains that the transition years after 1953 were the strangest of all. The Gulag was dying, but not dead. It became a ghost of itself, still counting, still working, still killing, but slower, gentler, like a machine that had forgotten its purpose. One man reached Magadan after walking for 2 months. He found a job unloading ships, the same kind of labor he had done in the camp. He was paid now, fed better, allowed to sleep. He said it didn't feel any different. At night he lined up his shoes neatly by the bed, just as he had for roll call. Old habits were safer than hope. Years later, when asked what freedom felt like, he said, "It felt like the same cold air, only quieter." The narrator's voice lowers. Stalin's death ended nothing. The men who survived carried the camps with them. They walked through cities like ghosts in borrowed clothes, flinching at sirens, measuring every word, still listening for a whistle that never came. Some found work, some remarried, some learned to smile again. But at night, they dreamed of barbed wire humming in the wind. They woke and checked their wrists for tags that weren't there. The world told them they were free, but the body doesn't forget captivity. It remembers in muscles, in hunger, in silence. One released prisoner, a teacher like the one from Minsk, kept going to the train station every morning. He stood on the platform, waiting for roll call. The guards were gone, the camp dismantled, but he stood there anyway. When asked why, he said, "They'll need someone to count us when it starts again." He was still there 20 years later, older, thinner, still counting. The narrator ends softly. When the Gulag finally closed, it didn't die. It dispersed. It went home with every man who had survived it. And somewhere in the north, winds still passed through the old fences, carrying a faint metallic hum, the sound of ghosts adjusting to freedom. Even after the gates rusted open and the files were stamped closed, the camps didn't vanish. The buildings rotted, the towers leaned, but the air stayed heavy, as if waiting for orders. Spring brought grass over the graves, and then autumn took it away again. The cycle kept the memory breathing. The narrator's tone slows. He walks through what used to be a yard. The snow crunches under his boots. Every few steps the wind changes direction, carrying the faint smell of oil, ash, and old metal. He says quietly that the Gulag didn't need bodies anymore to stay alive. It had entered the soil. Visitors arrive each summer, researchers, journalists, sons of men who never came home. They take pictures of rusted locks, half-buried shovels, the remains of a kitchen where rats have turned spoons into nests. Some stay only minutes, others sit for hours, not speaking, as if the ground itself might begin telling its story if given enough silence. In one collapsed barrack, there's a wall covered in scratches. Most are unreadable, but a few form letters. A linguist who examined them said they weren't a code or the names. They were attempts to remember how writing felt. A man's last act of language wasn't to speak, but to mimic the motion of it. The narrator explains that many survivors died decades later without ever telling their children what happened. They believed forgetting was the only way to protect the living. But forgetting doesn't erase. It hides, and hidden things grow. In the quiet towns built on top of former camps, locals still find bones when digging gardens. The government calls them archaeological remains. The locals call them neighbors. In 1991, when the archives briefly opened, people lined up for days to read their own family names. Some found nothing. Others found too much: letters signed by friends, confessions they didn't remember writing, and receipts for bullets. One woman read her father's file and said, "He died twice, once in the camp and again in these pages." The narrator walks farther into the ruins. The wind rises, moving through the broken walls, creating a low whistle that sounds almost human. He says softly that the Gulag made ghosts long before death because it taught men to disappear while still breathing. Those ghosts survived longer than the system itself. Every survivor carried a fragment, a gesture, a habit, a silence. Some still woke at the same hour as morning roll call. Others couldn't stand to see snow fall in silence. One man spent years building fences around his garden, then tearing them down over and over. When asked why, he said, "It helps me remember which side I'm on." The narrator tells of a former guard who returned to Kolyma as an old man. He brought flowers but couldn't find where to put them. He said the ground felt crowded. He sat on a stone and whispered names, some his, some not. When he stood up, his footprints had already filled with snow. The ghosts in this story aren't transparent. They're made of routine, a hand reaching for a non-existent ration, eyes flicking toward a sound that isn't there, lips moving through silent roll call. The Gulag didn't end. It changed form. It became the fear that stops laughter too soon, the pause before speaking in a crowded room, the suspicion that someone is always listening. At dusk, the narrator kneels by a mound barely visible under frost. There's no marker, only a small indentation where something heavy once lay. He brushes away snow and finds a fragment of wood with faded writing burned into it. "We lived once." He doesn't know who wrote it or when. Maybe it was the teacher or the poet or someone whose name never reached a file. Maybe it was written by a guard trying to remember his own reflection. It doesn't matter. The words tremble in the wind but refuse to disappear. He says quietly, "The Gulag was designed to erase. It failed. Every time we speak their stories aloud, the system loses another piece of its silence." He looks up. The sky's the color of iron, the same color the prisoners saw when they looked through the bars. Snow begins to fall again, steady, endless, like the pages of a history book that no one finished reading. There is no ending here, only continuity, the long echo between breath and memory, between a man's shadow and the space it leaves behind. The narrator's voice fades as he walks away, footsteps growing softer, until the only sound left is wind moving through wire. Then, almost as an afterthought, he says one final line. "They died once for the state and 1,000 times in our forgetting."